My very first video on YouTube was a tutorial on how I made these crow soldiers for Turnip28. Today I'm going to be continuing the army by building the leader, solid as Von Snake. I gave him a cigar and an eye patch to make him seem a little more like Big Boss from Metal Gear Solid, and then I gave him a feathery cloak with hand-sculpted feathers that I made with green stuff in order to tie him into the crow theme of the army. Today I'm going to be showing you how I did that so that you can bring those techniques to your own projects. I decided to make my Toff a mounted hussar with a raised saber, so I pulled out this Perry Miniatures mounted knight kit for the horse and a French hussar's kit for the rider. I'm just clipping the pieces out with my nippers and then cleaning them up with a rasp, followed by a sanding stick that's about 2000 grit. I really like the legs that have the vertical stripes running up the sides and the heads with the furry hats. I'm going to go ahead and apologize to the historical wargaming community for my ignorance on the actual names of these pieces of 1800s fashion. If you want to drop me a comment telling me the correct names, feel free. I always dry fit the pieces before I glue them in place. This is to test the fit and also make sure that the look is what I want. After that, I add some plastic cement and then hold the pieces together with a bit of pressure for about 10 or 15 seconds. Then I try to let the pieces sit for a while to make sure they've had time to set. You could paint the horse and rider separately, but I want to do a cape that flows along the length of the horse. And also, painting and sub-assembly is usually not actually that useful, at least in my experience, so I'm just going to go ahead and glue the rider onto the saddle here. I took ages figuring out exactly how I wanted to glue these saddlebags onto the horse, but I think in the end it doesn't even matter too much because I can hide the top of them with the cape later. I also wanted to add a saddlebag to the other side of the horse for symmetry, so I just hacked the other sheath off of this piece and attached it to the saddle on the other side. Now it's time to work on the capes. I'm going to grab a small piece of yellow and a small piece of blue and mix them together at about a 50-50 ratio. I always mix the pieces together for a solid couple minutes just to make sure there aren't any lumpy, unmixed bits in the stuff. I'm just flattening out the piece and then shaping it into a vaguely cape-like shape, then checking the size against the mini. I cut in a half-circle segment around where the neck will go and then smooth that out a bit. Then I'm going to stick it back on the mini and push the ends of the cape around the neck. I'll let this harden and then add in more green stuff for some of the folds and creases later on. Alright, the capes have hardened overnight, so I'm back to it. Now I'm adding the folds of the cape by rolling up a cylinder of green stuff that runs the length of the cape and pressing it against it. Next, I smooth the green stuff into a peak by exerting the pressure downwards and away from the peak with the flat silicone brush and smoothing everything out. I added a small piece of green stuff up at the top by the neck, then smoothed it out and pulled a bit towards the front of the shoulder. I'll be covering this end with a clasp later on, so I don't need to be too tidy here. To do the clasps, I'm cutting out a dinky little bit of green stuff, rolling it into a ball, then gently placing it over the end of the cape. Finally, just carefully press it into place and shape as desired. So unfortunately, I dropped my Toff and the three pieces came apart.
Oh, fuck!
So I'm gonna have to devise a better method to join them all together. This is actually fine. It'll make it easier to work on the cape later on. In order to fit the rider back on the horse a little better, I'm adding a little cylinder of green stuff to the legs, then mashing it on the saddle. Once it hardened, the rider was still coming off, so I ultimately decided to pin the two together. Pinning is probably the safest option when it comes to this, and it's a pretty straightforward process. You just take a rod, I made mine out of a paper clip, then drill holes in both pieces. After that, you glue the rod into both pieces, then glue all the pieces together. While I was at it, I decided to fix the sword sheath. I clipped it back off the saddlebag, then sanded down the strap that was left behind. After that, I just glued it in place with some plastic cement. Since we're an army of crow soldiers, we need our cloaks to be feathery to go with the theme. I'm going to be making individually sculpted feathers that I'll affix to the cloak later. To make the feathers, I roll out a cylinder of green stuff, press it down as uniformly as possible, then kind of shape it a little bit. Next, I'm using my sharp hobby knife to cut in shallow cuts all along the cylinder. You want to cut the marks in at an angle, and you'll have cuts running down both sides in parallel. Now you leave that to harden, and I actually waited overnight just to be safe. Finally, you take your hobby knife and cut out your feathers. Once you've cut around the feathers, go back in with the knife and carefully pick away the outside segments. Here's another process that I improved a bit through trial and error. It can be very wasteful if you make your cylinders too large, since you're cutting away the excess green stuff and it's already hardened and cured, so you can't really do too much with it. So for future feathers, I started making the cylinders the same size that I want my feathers to be. This cut down on the waste quite a bit. We need to make enough feathers to completely cover the cloak. I estimated that it would take about 4 rows of feathers and about 6 feathers per row for the back. That would make 24 feathers that we would need, but I also need to cover some of the front of the cape that is visible from other angles. So I just kind of went to town and made something like 50. In order to join the feathers to the cloak, I'm mixing up more green stuff, this time without the milliput, and using small balls and cylinders placed on the cloak that I push the feathers into. You're trying to make sure that the feather has good connection to enough green stuff and the green stuff is connected strongly to the cloak. The feathers are very tough at this point and no longer take on fingerprints or anything, so I was really just jamming them on there. We want to build up layers starting from the bottom to the top as well, with the upper layers laying over the top of the bottom layers. You also want to make sure that the directions of the cuts are pointing downwards. Another thing to consider is how much of the cloak should be covered. Personally, I think it looks best with as much of the cloak covered as possible, including both the front and the back of the cloak. I wanted to make a bedroll for the back of the horse. To do that, just roll up a cylinder of green stuff and push on the ends to bunch it out a bit. Then sand it down to make it look like a roll of bedding. To really tie it in, fashion some straps making tiny, thin cylinders and wrap those on either side of the bedroll, using the silicone shaping tools to blend it all together. Just for another little detail, I wanted to add an eye patch. This is really simple, since the strap of the patch would be hidden under the hat. Just make the tiniest little ball of putty you can, stick it over an eye, then monkey about it with the silicone shaper until you have an effect you like. With all of our details finished, we can finally affix everything together. To get the cape affixed, we just roll up a ball of green stuff, stick it to his back, then jam the cape on there. Finally, use the silicone shapers to blend everything in that's visible. So here's what the cape turned out looking like. I'm happy with how the final look ended up, but I do have some things I would have done a little bit differently. First of all, I realized that I do cover almost all of the inner layer of feathers. I probably could have saved a little bit of effort by just adding 2 on either side going all the way up to the top. And secondly, I didn't even really need to do the curves and folds because that was completely covered up. But overall, I think they turned out pretty well. And now that we're done with the model, it's time to get the base ready. I want to build up the base a bit with some cork. I like to repurpose my old wine corks for this because I really don't need too much for bases. I'm just chopping up the corks with my hobby knife and trying to make a variety of different shapes and sizes. Generally, I go for trapezoidal shapes, triangular shapes, and kind of sharp angular sides. To affix them to the base, I just use this gel super glue, but many different glues would work just fine. While we wait for the glue to dry, I'm going to mix up my texture paste. I just use a bit of sand, Mod Podge, and brown paint. The ratio I use is a little organic, changing from project to project, but I'm just trying to get a texture that has a little bit of flow to it, but still is fairly gritty. I'm just slathering the paste all over the bases and trying to keep it from pooling too much in any one section. Now that I've given the base time to dry, it's time to pin the model in place. I'm going to move the model around on the base to find the spot that I want to mount it. Then I'm drilling holes in the bottom of the spots where the horse will be touching the base. In this case, it's got 2 contact points, so I'm going to drill into the hoof and this bit that sticks off of the other hoof. Next, I'll set the model back on the base to find the points that I should be drilling into on the base. Then I'll drill down fairly deep in those same sections. After that, I'm going to put some glue on the paper clip and stick it into the base, then slather a bit more glue on the end and slide the model in place. Alright, well, we've got our Mini all assembled and ready to be primed and then painted finally. So I'm going to go ahead and make myself a coffee and get back to it. I typically paint my models following the classic GW process. Prime, base coat, wash, then highlight back up with several different layers of increasing brightness. It's a style that I like, and a process that I've slowly honed to achieve a look that I like, but I'm no heavy metal painter, so I'll leave the teaching to people like Vincent Venturella and Duncan Rhodes. Instead, I'm going to take this time to tell you a little story. The story of our main man here, who he is, and what his role is in the world of Turnip28. His name is Solidus von Snake, the veteran of 1,000 battlefields. At the Battle of the Broken Carrot, he charged into a break in the line, fighting back amidst heavy resistance and managing to capture the enemy colors. This great feat reversed the entire course of the battle, as routing units returned to the line and morale surged. Again, at the Battle of Horseradish Hill, he held his line steady amidst heavy shelling and repeated charges. Seeing the enemy's strength wavering, he pushed his men forward, and they were able to rout the enemy despite a large numerical disadvantage. He served in the 13th Foxgloves with distinction before mysteriously vanishing. Rumors swirled through the regiments of Sist about his fate, as he would be seen fighting in various conflicts throughout the continent. In time, it was discovered that he had formed his now legendary mercenary corps, the Steel Spuds, and was deploying them to various regions to serve some unknown purpose. The Steel Spuds all fought with the same distinctive fighting technique, simply known as CQC. In time, simply running operations for other groups wasn't enough for Solidus, and he sought to create his own nation where all soldiers would be free from the whims of political parties. Lions led by donkeys. This is the phrase summarizing the state of command and control in those days. While individual soldiers of every regiment would serve with distinction amidst true hardship, the Toffs and toadies in charge seldom sullied themselves by fighting their battles themselves, instead preferring to send the wretches in their charge into endless battles. Solidus had seen whole battalions perish due to massive blunders made by their superior officers in the field. This isn't to say anything of the petty motivations of high command, sending armies into conflict over an upturned cart of onions and sparing little thought for the lives of their troopers. Now the horde of crows who have been blindly marching for years have come under his command. At long last he has given them a purpose. His purpose. To create a nation of soldiers for soldiers, where true men of valor can at long last serve under someone who values their skills. Only time will tell how this development will affect the delicate balance of Sist. A rogue nation of the finest soldiers is sure to tip the balance of power, but in what direction? Will the man now known as Big Boss Crow use his force to establish order in this lawless land? A nation of soldiers needs war to fight, so peace doesn't seem to be a likely goal. But what is his goal? Only time will tell. So, partway through my project, I realized how adding the eyepatch had made me think of Big Boss, but I realized that he really needs a cigar to go with that effect as well. So I just took a tiny little cylinder of green stuff and chopped it down to a cigar shape with like a wider end and glued it to his mouth. Then I just painted it to look like a cigar with a burnt end. Now he really does look like a hussar snake. And with that, Solid Esfand Snake is complete, and we have the leader of our crow army all ready to deploy on the tabletop. So I hope you've been enjoying the Turnip28 content, because I've got a bunch more videos planned. I've got a terrain tutorial video coming out pretty soon on how to do the houses that I use for my terrain for Turnip28. I've got a battle report that I've been looking forward to making for a really long time. So if you're interested in either of those things, then I hope you subscribe and stay tuned to the channel because they'll be coming out very soon. And with that, I guess I will leave you with some glamour shots of the project. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you soon.